High in the Alps, on a melting glacier, a man has been lying in the ice for more than 5,000 years. When scientists finally cut open his frozen stomach, they didn't find some crude, mysterious caveman diet. They found a meal. Wild meat, animal fat, and a grain. Not modern wheat, something older. Something that was already ancient the day he ate it. It was the same grain that fed the first farmers who ever planted a field on purpose. The same grain that filled the storehouses of the world's earliest towns and put bread in the hands of the men who built the ancient world. For 10,000 years it fed us. And then, in the space of a few short generations, it vanished from almost every farm on Earth. So here's the question that should stop you cold. If a single grain carried human civilization for 100 centuries, if it was good enough for the very people who invented farming, why did we throw it away? Why is it missing from the fields, missing from the bread aisle, missing from the whole story we tell about where our food comes from? Most people just assume newer wheat is better wheat. That is not the whole story, and the part they leave out is stranger than any ban. Welcome to RootVault. If you'd rather remember what we've forgotten than lose it for good, take 1 second and subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of knowledge that slips away quietly. The grain is called Einkorn. In German, the name means single grain because unlike the fat, crowded heads of the wheat you know, each little stalk of Einkorn gives up just one seed at a time. It does not look like much, but this humble grass is the oldest cultivated wheat on the planet. Around 10 to 11,000 years ago, in the foothills of a volcanic mountain called Karacadağ, in what is now southeastern Turkey, human beings did something they had never done before. They stopped only gathering wild grass and started planting it on purpose. In 1997, a geneticist named Manfred Heun and an international team published a study in the journal Science that traced domesticated einkorn back through its own DNA. They compared hundreds of wild einkorn populations scattered across the Fertile Crescent, and the trail led to one single place, the wild grass growing on the slopes of Karacadağ. And that mountain sits only about 30 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, the astonishing stone temple raised around 9,500 BCE, thousands of years before the first pyramid. When we talk about einkorn, we are talking about the seed that agriculture itself grew out of. But here's the part almost nobody hears. Einkorn isn't just an old kind of wheat. It's the beginning of all of it. Every slice of sandwich bread, every bowl of pasta, every birthday cake, trace the family tree back far enough, and you arrive at this single-seeded grass on a Turkish mountainside. It was one of the very first plants our ancestors ever tamed, part of a tiny handful of founder crops that turned wandering hunters into settled farmers. Without something like einkorn, there are no villages, no storehouses, no cities at all, and that one change is what set everything else in motion. Because once you can grow grain and store it, you can suddenly feed people who aren't out hunting for their own dinner. You can feed builders, you can feed priests, and you can feed soldiers. For thousands of years across the ancient Near East and into early Europe, hulled wheats like einkorn and its close cousin emmer were the staple that kept entire populations alive. Grain was wealth. Grain was power. Armies never marched on courage alone. They marched on stored cereal, hauled in sacks and counted grain by grain in the granaries. So when you hear that a grain fed armies for 10,000 years, understand the literal truth of it. The raw manpower of the entire ancient world ran on grain like this. And we have proof it was still on the menu right up close to human history's edge. Remember the man in the ice? His name to us is Ötzi, a mummy discovered in 1991 in the Ötzi Alps, so perfectly preserved by the cold that researchers could actually study the contents of his stomach. In 2019, a team led by the microbiologist Frank Maxner published exactly what his final meal had been. Alongside ibex fat and wild deer meat, there it was, einkorn. A man who died more than 5,000 years ago ate the same grain that had already been feeding humanity for 5,000 years before him. Sit with that timeline for a second. Einkorn was an old friend to Ötzi, and it would go on feeding people for thousands of years after him too. So how does something that durable just disappear? Here's the detail that changes everything, and it's hidden in the plant's DNA. Einkorn is what scientists call diploid. It carries just 14 chromosomes, the original simple blueprint. It has never been hybridized. It is essentially wheat in its purest first form. Modern bred wheat is a completely different creature. Over thousands of years, wild wheats crossed and doubled up their genomes again and again, until today's bred wheat carries 42 chromosomes, 3 full sets stacked on top of each other. Now, that's not an insult to modern wheat. That extra genetic machinery is exactly what makes it so productive and so easy to bake with. But it also means the loaf you eat today is genetically a world away from what your ancestors grew. Einkorn stayed simple, and that simplicity turns out to be the key to both halves of this story, why it lost, and why some people now think it's worth saving. Because for all its stubbornness, Einkorn held onto things. Modern wheat gave up. It tends to run higher in protein than standard wheat. Its flour has a soft golden color, thanks to natural pigments called carotenoids, the same family of plant compounds behind the color in carrots and egg yolks. Growers and a number of studies point to more of certain minerals and antioxidants as well. Now, a careful word here, because this part actually matters. You will see Einkorn sold to people who can't handle modern wheat, and that deserves total honesty. Einkorn is not gluten-free. It contains gluten, and it is not safe for anyone with celiac disease, full stop. What is true is that its gluten is built differently, and some people with non-celiac sensitivity say they personally tolerate it better. The research on that is still thin. So if wheat genuinely makes you sick, talk to a doctor before you experiment. The point was never that Einkorn is a cure. The point is that it's a grain we abandoned long before we ever really understood it. So why did it go? Not a ban, not a plague, something much quieter. Einkorn has a flaw if you only care about one single thing, which is yield. Each stalk gives just one small grain, and that seed clings inside a tough hull that has to be stripped away before you can even use it. Extra work, extra time. As farming industrialized, growers wanted wheat that pumped out more grain per acre and threshed clean with no fuss at all. Modern high-yield varieties did exactly that. And so, field by field, season by season, farmers made the rational choice: more food, less labor, and the world's very first grain got quietly pushed off the land it had fed for 10,000 years. Here's the irony that should sting a little. The very qualities that let Einkorn carry humanity for 100 centuries were the same qualities that got it fired. It didn't fail us. It just wasn't efficient enough for a world that had started measuring food by the ton. And this is where it stops being about a grain at all. Einkorn's story is the story of a trade that nobody ever sat down and voted on. We chose more yield, more bushels, more calories per acre, and in choosing more, we quietly let go of things we didn't know how to put a number on. Flavor, genetic diversity, a living, unbroken link to the people who invented farming in the first place. Nobody was evil. There was no villain in a boardroom twirling a mustache. And that's what makes it haunting. A thing can carry your entire species for 10,000 years and still slip through your fingers in a couple of generations, simply because it didn't fit the new math. So, here's what I keep coming back to. How many other Einkorns are out there? How many foods, seeds, and whole ways of eating have we already half forgotten? Not because they were bad, but only because they were slow. The good news is that Einkorn never went fully extinct, and today you can hold 10,000 years of history right in your own kitchen. Here is how to actually do it. You can buy Einkorn two ways: as whole berries, which is the intact grain, or as flour. The whole berries are the easiest place to start. Rinse them, Then simmer them in plenty of water for around half an hour until they are tender with a little chew, and use them the way you would use rice or toss them into a salad. They taste nutty, almost toasted. Nothing like plain white rice. If you want to bake with it, know this going in, einkorn behaves differently than you expect. That weak, simple gluten means the dough is stickier and softer, so use less water than a modern recipe calls for. Mix it gently, and whatever you do not over-knead it. Overworking einkorn just turns it gummy. Let the dough rest. Your loaf will come out a little denser, a beautiful pale gold, with a flavour most people describe as sweet and almost buttery. And one more time, because it is the part that truly matters, einkorn contains gluten. If you have celiac disease, this is not for you. If you are simply curious, start with a small bag, cook a single batch, and pay attention to how it tastes and how you feel afterward. That is the entire experiment. So go back to that man in the ice. 5,000 years frozen on a mountainside. And in his very last meal, this same grain, the one you can now simmer on your own stove tonight. He did not think of it as ancient or rare or special. To him, it was just food, the oldest, most ordinary miracle there is. We are the ones who forgot. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe, because for every einkorn we almost lost, there's another forgotten food still waiting here in the vault. And the next one is already on its way.